NATO accused of false flag attacks in Ukraine. Coming up.
The third force in eastern Ukraine. Kiev copies George Bush's plans for Iraq. And mainstream hosts storm out of the studio.
Killing your own citizens, then blaming another nation to start wars called a false flag attack. The most infamous is Operation Himmler. Nazis murdered fellow Germans, then blamed Poland to start World War II. Nazis trained by NATO were the vile snipers during the Maidan protests who shot both sides, both the police and their own supporters. It helped spark the violence that brought the coup d'etat. Leaked images show Ukraine nationalists Una Unso being trained to use sniper rifles by NATO. These false flags, writes intelligence author F. William Engdahl, are just the latest atrocity in the documented NATO Operation Gladio. Decades of terror attacks that have killed hundreds throughout Europe have actually been funded and planned by the White House. Top-level officials in the government and the CIA have confirmed. In what Wikispooks calls the most shocking story ignored by the mainstream, Gladio is admitted by former CIA head Bill Colby to be a major operation. Operations like the massacre at Bologna rail station, which killed 85 people and injured hundreds more. EU Parliament passed a resolution condemning the terror, demanded NATO stop and carry out a full investigation. The US simply ignored it. Evidence shows this US campaign of terror continues today, notes the world's leading scholar on Gladio, Dr. Daniel Ganser. FBI whistleblower Sybil Edmonds, who ACLU calls the most gagged person in US history, revealed the CIA's actually expanded the program internationally under codename Gladio B. The same professional snipers as in Kiev, writes Global Research News, have been found shooting both sides in countries throughout the world that offer resistance to the US. Political analyst Eric Draitser joins us. Really great to talk to you. What's going on?
Who's behind the snipers? That they work in the service of Western intelligence. This is quite clear. Likely private contractors, private mercenaries who are paid to create this kind of chaos. Those who probably cut their teeth on the battlefields of Afghanistan and in Iraq, who now are essentially murderers for hire, who are sent anywhere where the United States or its allies deem necessary to create chaos. So you mentioned a couple of examples in Syria, in Ukraine, in Venezuela. We should also remember, of course, Thailand in 2010. We saw a very similar situation there. Egypt most recently as well. This is a standard tactic, create a casus belli for the United States to have a military presence for decades to come.
The world's main instigator of false flags, notes the editor of upcoming book Flashpoint in Ukraine, Dr. Stephen Lenman, is the United States. The US hasn't been threatened with a real attack in hundreds of years, writes the author of Questioning the War on Terror, Dr. Kevin Barrett. The only way to force war on its population is through terror-inducing false flags. 266 American sailors were killed on the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. Using the slogan, "Remember the Maine," the establishment blamed an enemy mine, then colonized Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Admiral Hyman Rickover later revealed it had nothing to do with the enemy. The explosion came from inside the ship. The entire US Joint Chiefs of Staff called for another, quote, "Remember the Maine incident" with Operation Northwoods. Declassified documents show Pentagon plans to blow up a US ship, hijack passenger planes, down an airliner from the US full of college students, wage a, quote, "terror campaign" in Miami, other cities, and Washington, D.C. The false flag attacks must be, quote, "widely publicized in mainstream media" to cause a, quote, "helpful wave of national indignation." The plans signed off by Armed Forces Chief Lyman Nemnitzer were blocked at the last minute by a horrified President Kennedy. It was opposition to out-of-control militarism, writes James Douglas in JFK and the Unspeakable, that Douglas says got Kennedy killed by the intelligence services. It is one of the versions for his assassination. Northwood's mastermind Lemnitzer was put in charge of NATO, where he, quote, hoisted the black flag of terror in Europe under Operation Gladio, notes the book Gladio, NATO's dagger at the heart of Europe. Kennedy's removal left the path clear for successor Lyndon Baines Johnson to return false flags to centre stage. Within less than a year, LBJ fabricated the attack that plunged the US into the Vietnam disaster. The president made up a non-existent strike on US ships in the Gulf of Tonkin and said, quote, our boys are floating in the water. The lie goaded Congress into authorizing war, killing more than 3 million Vietnamese and 58,000 US servicemen. President Bush Jr. told British Prime Minister Blair that if he couldn't get UN approval to bomb Iraq, he'd paint a US jet in UN colours and try to get it shot down over Iraq to justify invasions.